By 2075, mankind has progressed to the point where leisurely flights in space are possible, where Mars has been traversed by man, where a livable city on the moon has been constructed, and where the bountiful resources on Jupiter are almost in harvestable reach. Dangerously, one thing previously left ignored has now become a priority of space committees and organizations, that being the numerous pieces of debris created by many previous haphazard excursions. Abandoned projects such as satellites have become huge disasters waiting to happen. In space, these tiny, seemingly insignificant pieces of metal or other items left by man can travel to such velocities that one screw can destroy an entire spaceship. In Planet S, we follow the lives of a debris-collecting crew, an occupation that's left so overlooked that it's seriously understaffed. In Planet S, our heroes aren't rewarded heavily for their life-risking journeys to collect debris, but rather left with meager salaries, the crew being the least important or funded section of its company of Technora. In Planet S, space travel is no longer some insane dream, and all of its resources are monopolized by a handful of nations and corporations. We are introduced to Technora's debris section alongside newly hired optimist Tanabe, who's still very starry-eyed about working in space, being the first time she's been off Earth. These hopes are somewhat dashed in the whiplash that is discovering her bizarre colleagues, who share a more pessimistic, carefree view of space, seeing it has become their job with no novelty left. Tanabe's introduction to her co-workers is fun, as we see everyone in the crew just trying to fill the boring downtime of office work, entertainingly showing how different space exploration is in this world compared to what we might expect. The daily life and work in space is still tedious. Space is a lot more natural for the crew who've spent many combined years working here. Some might have joined as optimistic as we see Tanabe just has, but their beginning hopes didn't exactly end with them achieving what they sought to. Highlighted among all the eccentric debris team members is Hachimaki, the previous youngest member of the debris section, who becomes Tanabe's teacher through her learning process. Hachimaki himself is a bit cynical, his current occupation being vastly far from his dream of becoming a renowned astronaut and ship owner, him seeking to discover unknown areas in space, yet he hasn't made much progress since he originally started working in space with Technora. Tanabe and Hachimaki's relationship is interesting, their discussions efficiently characterizing them early on. Tanabe optimistically believes that Hachimaki could fulfill his dream, as she looks up to him as her teacher, but Hachimaki believes his bleakness is more real and truthful. It's not just that Tanabe is optimistic and Hachimaki is pessimistic, it's that Hachimaki doesn't believe he can move up in the company and become a pioneer, and that someone else, higher up, will. We see Hachimaki shackled with being part of the debris section, and despite his previous failed efforts to progress through this job, he's left cynical about his future. Despite Hachimaki's skills as an astronaut, him working as a debris collector seriously undermines him by his general superiors of Technora, who likely wouldn't give him a chance to move up because that involves them taking a risk to their profits. Debris collecting, which might seem boring at first, is actually a great way of exploring much more complex topics in spacefaring, whether it's the bureaucratic nature of space conversation, with the crew needing express permission to collect certain debris, or the fact that some of what's dumped in space is left by the same governing bodies that presents themselves as caring for space's environment, such as INTO, which is a collective of first world countries who seek to regulate and control space militaristically themselves. Every little piece of scrap has some kind of story or idea wrapped around it, which we explore through the episodes, making the occupation our characters share so interesting and meaningful. And as we follow Tanabe through her tests at the debris section with Hachimaki, we see how much skill really goes into collecting even the smallest scrap in orbit. Our astronauts don't move super precisely in space with their suits, but they have a visually floaty motion, adding a lot of weight to their work, and tension, as debris can move unpredictably at times. Tanabe's optimism drives her motivation in improving, so that she can make space cleaner and safer for everyone, even if debris is still added by those higher up so carelessly. Her attitude really helps liven up the trash collecting parts because she believes so much in what she does, and we see her develop passion for it. Despite her beginnings as fairly untrained and unskilled, Tanabe really does develop gracefully under the crew's care, and seeing her learn from all her seniors is uplifting. Even through conflict, we see Tanabe's optimism persist because she believes so much in the people around her. Her faith in others easily drives the plot, especially when new characters join the cast. Sometimes her blind optimism can be very detrimental, which Hachimaki's usually quick to criticize Tanabe for, But other times, Tanabe's belief in others ultimately saves them from conflict, adding some credence to her belief. It's also narratively engaging, as we have to discern new characters' true intentions, whether they're truthful about their situation or just lying to Tanabe and the crew. We also come to see how each debris section member really cares about what they do, even if the company itself doesn't place so much value in them. They know that they're necessary for keeping people safe, at preventing previous fatal accidents from reoccurring, and that's what motivates them, even if they'd be more respected in another job. It's interesting to see just what keeps each member from leaving the debris section, why they don't find another job. Everyone has come to this department for a different reason, and as we learn about each character of the crew throughout the anime, it adds more context to their interactions amongst each other and their different philosophies. The characters become so much more interesting because we get to see them all try to make the best of their situations, which really drives us to understand them more fundamentally and to see their core motivations and thematic weight. The heroes in the story aren't scientists or explorers, it's the glorified waste collectors in space. This really sets the realistic tone for the narrative, while also humbly providing a lot of interesting, smaller stories surrounding them, as the crew are more closely connected to other struggling people through their work. The humbleness of the debris section, which we are constantly reminded of throughout the story, just really helps show an interesting perspective to space, which would be completely glossed over in other views. It can really say a lot about society and its politics from this angle, such as the corruption present in these corporations, or the ignoring of such important threats like the debris. The beginning half of the series is heavily episodic, with one contained story that is usually resolved by the end of an episode, but the writing really makes these episodes carry impact due to the graceful showcase and development of the series' themes that slowly connects everything. One of my favorite episodes early on involves the crew finding a coffin in space. Something that once was an astronaut's wish to be buried in space has now become a threat to the safety of travelers. It becomes more complicated when they contact the next of kin that the body and coffin belongs to. They can't just easily destroy the objects now. The episode explores the concept of being buried in space, how one can be so overcome and obsessed with space that they overlook anyone on Earth, which Tanabe believes is depressing and rude to the astronaut's surviving family. Yet Hachimaki argues it's what the astronaut sought in his will. Every little incident is interesting because it's not just straightforward. There's usually at least two different ideas on the subject of the episode, oftentimes represented by Hachimaki and Tanabe, so it doesn't feel too preachy or opinionated in one idea. It's also great because usually the end result or truth of the matter isn't exactly what anyone predicted it would be, making every situation less predictable and more complex. The idea of debris itself appears so interestingly in the story. It shows no matter how fast science has progressed, morality and mankind's frequency to rush through their problems still remains. Those in power, such as the highly salaried scientists and engineers, and the executives of Technora and other companies, often purposely ignore or at least remain ignorant of the consequences of their actions. Whether it's the race to create more efficient engines to power man's flight to Jupiter, or the planning on how to most profitably extract highly valuable resources from space, they rarely acknowledge the waste they introduced into space, or the discrimination and theft of certain nations' resources down on Earth. The story shows how the advancement of science isn't an objective good. It's a tool that in this case has been monopolized by people in power, them seeking to increase the power and economic difference between nations and people they're at odds with. A big conflict narratively and thematically in the world of Planet S is that not everyone has equal odds or ability to achieve their goals in space, which we've also seen through the crew itself. When morality and ethics are so far behind science's run, disastrous conflicts can begin, which we find in the unfolding of the story. As the narrative progresses and the episodic nature of the story dissolves, the debris crew themselves also have to think about their neutral attitude to certain issues. As the world becomes more politically volatile, the crew can no longer remain bystanders. They have to be more complicit and progressive in their actions than before. They've become more entangled with the world's events, especially when space organizations attempt to use the debris collectors for their own agendas discreetly, trying to keep their motivations secret to our characters. It puts the crew in an interesting position, especially when they might have to question orders from Technora or Into. It strips away the idea that waste collection in space can be unbiased, like how the biases of science was explored previously. There also starts to be real consequences and disasters for our crew as the narrative tensions rise, which drives some character-driven psychological exploration. There's a real danger to their job, how quickly your life can be debilitated by a mistake due to the cold and uncaring character of space itself. Space does no favors for mankind, which himself has unnaturally made its appearance. It's terrifying and depressing to see how even the strongest-willed astronauts have their bodies slowly weaken and fail them. We see this with a lot of side characters who are sick from space radiation caused from decades in space. But these threats also start to become present in our main cast's life. It's great to see how Tanabe herself and her optimism is challenged by these unfolding events. She really gets a lot of maturation compared to her beginning, annoyingly self-assuredness as she has to deal with the ramping narrative and as she's forced to consider other characters' ideas. Through the story, we also get to see others that work for Technora and the governing bodies of space, although they usually look down on our debris collectors. It's nice to learn more about these characters because we see how detached some of these people really are from the population on Earth. It starts to become understandable how they can feel superior to those on Earth, who rely on space for their energy needs. The executives in space are easily able to do wrong because they justify their actions through the idea of a greater good. But really, they're just here to better themselves and maybe their nations. I think the politics in Planetes are great. It shows how just because man can leave Earth, they won't necessarily leave their discriminations behind. Some nations' people are completely blacklisted from contracts in space due to the companies in space having conflict with their government. There's also some antagonists, being a group of militarized space terrorists that seek to cripple and prevent scientific development, to pry spatial territory from Into and all the companies capitalizing on space resources. It's interesting and compelling to see how some believe that the solution is to stop this progression of science. They have good arguments as well, yet there are still so many forces that have pushed humanity into space, such as the limited energy and power on Earth. What is the right choice? To return to Earth and attempt to repair it there, or to hope we find the answers in space? And can a decision even be made, or are we forced to continue this road? Planetes really does a great job of portraying the loneliness of space, especially seen in the empty, black backdrops that astronauts are casted on. When you're so far away from Earth, from your family and close ones, you can become lost easily. It's interesting to see how our crew anchors themselves, or at least attempts to, so far from home. Some attempt to dedicate themselves entirely for the advancement of their field in space, but without anyone to ground you, the reason and motivation for this goal can quickly dissipate. It's hard being in space. It's impossible to abandon your humanity in hopes of achieving your goal. It will only prevent you from it. But through the story, we see some characters who, despite all the forces of the world trying to prevent them from it, seek to fulfill their dream. It's interesting to see how characters like Hachimaki, with so much potential, can lose all motivation due to less debilitating instances. It really humbles Hachimaki throughout the story when he meets these people with such strong will, even if their bodies are weak or they're so ignored by the rest of the world. Not everyone has the privilege or abilities to see their dream transform into reality, but Hachimaki might. He at least has better odds than many, so he really should go full on ahead with his opportunity. As Hachimaki slowly regains his motivation through the help of the main crew, and especially Tanabe, his progression starts to become more noticeable, especially with how much realer his obstacles become. To see him go farther than he previously did is a great narrative on its own, aside from the other characters and world-based plotlines. But in the context of the established world, it is so much better. It's especially compelling as he has to question what's worth sacrificing for his goal, what consequences are acceptable. I think what Planetes shows is that it's not entirely the end goal that changes things for the world. It wasn't landing on Mars that changed space politics or ethics. It was the pursuit. It's mostly in the pursuit of these dreams and the many decisions leading up to the goal that society, morality, and ethics can change. Great damage can occur if pursuiters are blind to the consequences, if they can rationalize it so much that human life is a resource allowed to be gambled away. But in the pursuit, there is also the choice to defend humanity, to believe people are capable of doing good no matter their past or background, which Tanabe really lives by. Climbing a mountain just because it's there might be okay if you're just risking your life, but not when you risk the lives of others. And science does not benefit everyone equally when discrimination precedes it. One of the greatest things about Planetes is its beautifully orchestrated soundtrack, which functionally adds grandness to the scenes of space. The volume and instruments of the songs in these big moments really ramp up scenes with tension or a sense of triumph and victory, though it's never too involved to the point of removing spectacle from the visuals themselves. The soundtrack can also be sensitive to the more somber human elements, with more intimately basic and lower tempo music, adding a lot to the important dialogues and discussions. The visuals also have a really nice feel to it, especially in debris collecting scenes. The animation adds a graceful beauty to their movement, and things really have a floaty and dreamy feel. It really animates the gravity well. Even when indoors of the Technora station, gravity is non-existent. It really grounds us in the space setting. The color scheme and designs also really nail the tone Planetes is going for. The color palette is somewhat vibrant, but really dulled. It's very inoffensive and sanitized, like the face Technora presents itself as. I love the debris crew's ship, named the Toy Box, and how clunky it is, instead of super elegant like some other grander and more fantastical spaceships look in fiction. It reinforced the real humble and endearing quality of the debris section, especially with how every time they use it, some handle or screw breaks off, showing its wear. It really contrasts with the excellent ships that Technora gives to their other sections, like the airplane-looking transporters, or the big Technora station itself. Visuals greatly work in tandem with the story. We see the tone being effectively shown in the visuals themselves, adding to its use in the writing of the show. I will say, sometimes characters' quality and, the character design quality can vary through the episodes, occasionally looking a little jarring, such as their faces. And the animation isn't always super fluid or full of motion, but visually, it's still very scenic and beautiful during the low action moments. In conclusion, if you want an interesting look at sci-fi and space, with a really well-paced character dilemma and journey, while also having fun slice-of-life moments that delve into some human conflicts and politics, Planetes is great. Seriously, I don't want to talk more than I already have, or spoil some seriously fantastic arcs and sequences, which I don't think needs any discussion to stand out by themselves. Planetes is one of my favorite animes. The beginning 2 episodes might be pretty slow, and some of the exposition is off-putting and seems directionless, but afterwards it really gets good at making debris and the episodic nature interesting. And when the overarching stuff kicks in, it really leads into a satisfying ending. So my final score is going to be a 10 out of 10. I just rewatched this anime for the review, and I thought it was great. I wanted to watch, when I first watched it, I wanted to make a review on it, but I didn't know what to say, really. Hope you enjoy this. If you've not watched it, you should give it a watch, I guess. It's 10 out of 10. I just said that, so, come on. Oh, subscribe and like and comment, and, yeah, subscribe, so.